person. Now, the Marxist idea is predicated on the fundamental assumption that, I would say, that individualistic Western capitalist culture is corrupt beyond redemption, and that it's fundamentally erected to do nothing but benefit those who happen to have the maximum power. And so then you get the racial issue like white privilege, and you get the patriarchy idea, that it's white men in particular who've created this only for themselves, and that all of the processes that are used to support this system, including logic and rationality and dialogue, all of those things are only offshoots of the desire for that small group of power-mad creatures to maintain their dominance over the rest of the world. And the only reason that there's any wealth associated with that is because the wealth was generated as a consequence of oppression. Now, the thing is that that story is partially true in that every society that human beings have ever created has a tyrannical aspect, and every society has a corrupt aspect. But what the Marxists make a variety of conceptual errors in their critique, I think. And the first is that instead of comparing Western culture to every other culture that ever existed, which is the proper comparison, they compare it to some hypothetical utopia that would be brought about if any given postmodern neo-Marxist happened to acquire the reins of power like Stalin did. And their fundamental implicit claim is, well, what happened in the Soviet Union and in Maoist China wasn't real communism, but if you let me take the reins of power, I would usher in the utopia against which our current society is so terrible in comparison to. It's like, well, our society is terrible in comparison to any utopia, but it's not as terrible as the society that utopians bring about. I can tell you that. And that's something so awful. Then you think, well, what about comparing Western civilization to other civilizations? It's okay, well, go ahead, do it. Do it. Read your damn history and see what you conclude. It's like, for all of its flaws, and there are many, many flaws, there's never been a system on the planet that has brought so much good to so many people in such a short time. As we sit here today, 300,000 more people in the world will have electricity. And we're eliminating poverty in the world so fast you cannot believe it. So in the year 2000, for example, the UN set up a goal that would see poverty halved across the world by 2015, and they actually reached it in 2013. I mean, think about that. In 13 years, it's not even a generation, a number of people who live in absolute poverty was halved. And if you look around the world, the rate at which the middle class is being generated is absolutely unparalleled at any time or place, by orders of magnitude. And so, like, what's the problem here exactly? Well, are we raping the planet? Well, yeah, for sure, but it's doing the same to us. And that's the other thing that the radical leftists don't ever consider. It's like people do all sorts of destructive things, and they don't live in perhaps the most harmonious way with the planet itself. But Jesus, mostly what we're trying to do is not die. And well, really, I mean, good God, think about where we live. It's like, you can't live here. You're bloody African apes, You can't live here. It's too cold. And so from November to March, you're basically staving off freezing to death in a few hours using this vast industrial complex that we've built. And it's like, it's certainly, we pay a price for it. And maybe it's not sustainable in its current form, but it's not like we don't have our reasons. It's not just rapaciousness and greed. And the idea that Western society is nothing but oppressive it's an untenable idea. It's simply wrong. I mean, we know this even technically, because one of the things we know is that although there are prejudicial attitudes that keep deserving people from occupying the positions where they would be of most benefit to themselves and to other people. We know, for example, that if you want to be successful in a Western culture, there's two things that are of great benefit. And one is that you're conscientious, which means you're hardworking and you have integrity. And the other is that you're intelligent. And those are very powerful predictors of success. And to me, they actually validate the culture itself, because you got to ask yourself, is like, who do you want to be successful? And maybe smart, hardworking people are the right people to rise to the top. And that is not to say that everyone at the top is smart and hardworking. Like, these aren't absolutes, they're tendencies. But at least we've got that tendency going. It accounts for about 25-30% of the variance, which means 2/3 of what makes people rise to the top is still determined by factors outside of that. But you don't have that relationship in the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is, you really how many people migrate away from North America somewhere else? And why is that? Why is that? Well, it's because for all of its faults, and there are many, because people are faulty, and that's wired right into them, for all of its faults, this is as good as we managed to do. And to be foolish enough to let that sink because we're comparing it to some utopia and whose manifestations we have already experienced in the most horrifying possible way is absolutely reprehensible. There's no excuse for it whatsoever. And I actually think that, so Derrida, for example, called Western culture phallogocentric, and what he meant by that was that it was predicated on the phallus, so that's the masculine patriarchy element, and also predicated on logos, he was thinking about it as the root word of logic. But the criticism is actually deeper than that, because there's an idea in the West that's very, very deep, and it's the fundamental idea in the West, and that is that logos, which is basically the essence of your soul, that might be the way of thinking about it, is the thing that constantly mediates between chaos and order. And this is a very powerful technical claim. A very similar claim, by the way, is made in Taoism. But the idea is that what a human soul does is confront the chaos of potential. And you kind of know that you live like that. You're always trying to realize your potential, whatever that is, and you're trying to realize the potential of the world. So you confront this chaotic potential, and by using your logos, which is your consciousness and your capacity to think, but even more importantly, your capacity to speak, because that helps you correct errors, right? You think and you're full of errors, and then you talk and people tell you why you're stupid, and then maybe you get a little bit smarter. That's really the point. Because when you think, you're still going to be subject to your own biases. But if you speak publicly, then people will tell you in no uncertain details just exactly what's wrong with you and your stupid ideas. And hopefully you can listen and you won't be such a moron the next time you have something to say. But the idea that the West is founded on is that the human soul confronts the potential of chaos and generates habitable order out of it. And that's why the individual has divine status, let's say, in the West. That's why in our oldest books, the idea is that the human being was made in the image of God, because God is also the thing that takes potential and transforms it into order. This is a profound idea, and it's something that the postmodernists, they hate that idea. They absolutely hate it, and that's why they won't do things like engage in dialogue, right? Dialogue is the shared logos. That's the root of the word. They won't engage in dialogue because in their world, your identity is either oppressor or oppressed. That's back to the Marxism that underlies postmodernism. And that's all you are. You're whatever your ethnicity is, or your racial group, or your sexual identity, or whatever identity group they want to come up with, because they can be infinitely fractionated. And you're either an oppressor or an oppressed. And that's all there is to you. You're just a member of a group. And if you're oppressed, then you're good, and then if you're an oppressor, then you're bad. But the problem with that, even though there's some truth in it, because I could pick out an identity dimension for any of you that you're an oppressor along, and another dimension along which you're oppressed, no problem. But the problem with that is that it doesn't actually tell you what to do. And this is also the problem with the postmodern identity. Identity isn't just who you think you are, and it's certainly not your bloody ethnicity or your sexual preference or anything so stupid. And the reason for that is that your identity is what you use to operate in the world. It's what makes you a functional person, and not only as far as other people are concerned, but as far as you're concerned, but also as far as nature itself is concerned. An identity is more like the toolkit that you use to operate in the world. And, being black or being white or being gay, that's not a toolkit to operate in the world. At best, it's a shallow description of one dimension of your being. And identity is something that you have to negotiate with other people because they need to trade with you. It's you have something to offer, and if I have something to offer, then we can communicate. And hopefully it's good for you, and it's also good for me. We both benefit from that. And that's identity. It's these ideas that identity is, first of all, subjective whim, which is what's been basically written into Bill C-16. It's That's a really poorly socialized 3-year-old thinks that. Is that I'm whoever I want to be and no one else has anything to say about it. It's like, well, try that on the playground and see how many kids will play with you. It's like 0, unless they're forced to, you know.